Well, thank you all for coming back. And as we've promised throughout the day, this is your chance now to ask some questions to the panelists. We've had some, I think, some interesting different vantage points taken on this. If I could set the ball rolling, just a couple of questions on fact. One, a very particular fact. One, a more general comment from each of you on how we should treat one of the sources for evidence. So one of the differences in account that we heard was, this is a very specific fact, was on the bodies of those killed at Ballygreman House. Andy, maybe you could talk a bit about, you referred to the fact that we now know that there was a disinterral and a reburial. What do we know about that, just to fill us in to the extent that you can?
Is this working? So this is, the historian who discovered this was actually Barry Keane, who has written one of the book on the massacre, and he found out that there had been disinterred. This was some years later, and the three, the Honeybrookes and Wood, were buried in consecrated ground in a Church of Ireland graveyard. We don't know which one. It's somewhere in West Cork. I have been on to Bishop Colton to try and see if the Church of Ireland know anything about this, but we weren't able to track it in Church of Ireland records or burial records. But we have to assume that this occurred. It's funny enough. It's based on a document in Catholic Diocesan Archive of all places, and it relates to property. But the archivist there passed this document on to Keane. But I think anyone who's interested in this needs to approach Barry Keane, who has a copy of the relevant document, and take it up with him.
But there's confidence in the quality of the evidence, as it were.
I've seen the document, and I would say that is. I'd say this happened. Yes, I believe that.
Has there been any corroboration from any in the RCB for any parish burial records?
We've tried that. We looked at, for example, Farron Thomas is the most obvious place to go because it's just over the hedge, and we certainly checked that, and there was a blank plot, and but it wasn't that one anyway. But we weren't able to go any further with this, to find any more. But that's not to say it's not in the Church of Ireland records somewhere. But we haven't been able to find it with what searching has been done so far.
But I have to say, there doesn't seem to be any official recognition of that. When Bishop Colton did his tour, he went to that Farron Thomas, and he laid flowers, but he didn't lay it particularly at a grave. He just laid it. Farron Thomas, I think, is near the bog where they killed. Isn't that correct?
No, that's the original burial site. Was in the bog in Farron Thomas, near Newcestown.
Yes,
that's where they were originally buried, which was bogland at the time, but it has since been, it's restored agricultural land now.
But I didn't. How sure are we of that even?
I think we're fairly sure that that's where they went. There is a dispute over it, I know. But I think that the evidence points to Farron Thomas, as far as I can see.
On a slightly wider point about evidence, I mean, starting with Gemma, you all referred to the compensation claims and the fact that the way in which the questionnaire that generated the compensation claims, to some extent, led the witnesses. As historians, both in this case and then more broadly, when you're looking at that kind of evidence or Bureau of Military Pensions evidence, how do you go about weighing up the bias both of the individual and the way in which that evidence is being gathered? How do you weigh it, Gemma?
Yeah, so great question. So every source has its pitfalls and its benefits. In some ways you want bias because you want to know how people saw themselves and what their views were and how they put them forward in certain ways. So it's often about representation and self-representation rather than some sort of quest for truth. But, when there are particular issues with compensation documents, there are certain things you can do to, I looked at, scale. I looked at 2,000 or so of them. You can cross-check, you can map, you can sort of start to identify certain patterns in language and how they might have helped each other or copied each other in some sort of in some kind of cases, and sort of look for patterns, supplement with other sources. But the fact is that, yeah, of course they're flawed, because you're going to put forward the best account that gets you the money at the end of the day. Yeah, right. But it doesn't mean to say that it's not a binary, as I was saying at the end of the lecture. It's not a binary between truth and lies. The way you present yourself is certainly very interesting. So if we take those into account, there's still sources of information of normal people of all different classes who we wouldn't hear about them otherwise. So that's why I think they're so valuable, because it's women as well, and people filling in these forms whose voices we might not otherwise hear.
I was hearing Eve Morrison talking about her new book on Kilmichael, and talking about how the pensions applications from members of Cumann na Món were much more detailed than many of their male counterparts, precisely because they weren't carrying arms, and therefore they were assumed to need to prove their commitment to the national struggle in much greater detail than their male counterparts. And the value of that to historians now is enormous. But I'm interested, because Brian, you and Andy perhaps took slightly different views on how we should weigh claims about these people being, as it were, loyalists, actively committed to supporting the Crown based on similar data.
I mean, perhaps Gemma can be clear about this. In these claims to the money for people who were loyalists after the war, what they had to specify were their links to the British government and how they'd been affected because of that. But there was, and they might mention their religion incidentally, but they got no compensation for simply standing up and say, I was a Protestant, I was attacked. That wasn't enough. You had to give a British connection of some sort. So that would lead them to emphasise any connections with British involvement. Although I have to say, I mean, these documents are important, but I still get back to the point, I find it very hard to understand how these can be seen as a motivation for why they were attacked. If these attacks had happened in August 1921, I could have understood it completely. Just after the War of Independence, then the question of informers and loyalists would have been a very topical one. But this happens 10 months later. 10 months later. That's why I find it hard to accept that these claims that these people had any sort of loyalist links with the British military in the War of Independence was a relevant factor.
Andy, you take it over you.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, going back to the War of Independence period, when the spies and informers killed in the south of Ireland, 70% of them were Catholic. And that was, broadly speaking, the case in County Cork, but in West Cork it was slightly different. Higher share were Protestant, but perhaps 55% were Protestant. So it was actually a little bit different than everywhere else. So already this idea that Protestants were more involved in informing or espionage or working with anti-Sinn Féin society, I think this idea had taken seed already in 1921, and it accelerated in 1922. So the anti-Sinn Féin idea, the idea I'm putting forward is that this is what the IRA believed in that area. I don't believe that the Protestants were necessarily involved in an anti-Sinn Féin society. Some may have been assisting and providing information, certainly, but the anti-Sinn Féin society was a Crown force body and tactic, which unfortunately I think exposed the Protestants very badly after British withdrawal. In terms of the sources, the compensation claims are very important to help us build up a picture of who was attacked. And there's a little bit of a difference between Ballineen and Askeen, and also the Manway Clonakilty area, and they do seem to imply in Dunmanway that some of them at least were close to Crown forces in terms of trading and so on, and this went against them. They may not have been spying, they may have been just trading with Crown forces for commercial reasons. They were trying to make a shilling, but that really very much went against them, I think, in 1922. But these claims are very important in helping us build up a social profile of who was attacked. Now, of course, the IRA evidence, on the other hand, is quite different. Getting the pension was a struggle. Only 10% of the people who applied actually got a pension at the end of the day. But again, they're very valuable in giving us an insight into what happened in Ballineen and Eskeen. They provide us with an insight that we don't otherwise have. And we can see how the IRA saw it, rightly or wrongly. It's committed to paper. It's a document we can analyse. And that's the problem, is up to now we haven't seen where this is coming from.
But another question must be, when are those IRA people giving their statements? Is it sometime afterwards?
Oh yeah, this would be in the mid-30s.
Yes, but you see, they've been trying to justify that these were dastardly acts that Eamon de Valera, Michael Collins, Erskine Chilton, everybody condemned. These men were wriggling around for excuses. These were just excuses for sectarian murder. I mean, if they'd been given at the time, but they're given later. And no one would come out in the IRA and say, I was quite happy with shooting all those Protestants. And they just wouldn't do that.
Well, that's because they could be convicted, the fear of conviction.
Yeah, but
it was.
This would have gone against the image of the bold Irish Republicans. You know, they weren't going to come out and say that.
Don, you were going to...
I was going to comment on a few things, particularly, I mean, you talked about the Anti-Sinn Féin Society and the coffee killings. Now, if you look at this official list, let's say, that the Paddy O'Brien drew up for the Dunmanway area, absolutely none. They said they also suspected quite a number of people being involved in both the coffee killings and the Anti-Sinn Féin Society, but none of those were targeted in.
Yeah.
So there was no link, as far as I could see, with coffee in April.
Well, the Anti-Sinn Féin thing it was 1921, and then many of them fled, and some of them were killed. The IRA thought they'd killed some of them, but then they didn't know some of them. They stayed in the pension claims till later.
But yet the guy was still doing his poem.
Sorry?
But just in the Southern Star, that guy was still doing his poem in April the 1st, 1982, saying they're now not defended anymore.
I think this is an interesting point about chronology, really, because we're looking back, so it's easier for us to periodise and say, like as Brian says, well, that was 10 months later. I think we all know that memories last longer than 10 months. In the sense that at the time, even if we're officially in a truce or in a war, we don't know how they. It's harder to see how they saw it as still being potentially being in the middle of it. So I agree, with your position on the causes behind it, but. I do think there is something to be said about this idea of, that's very hard to pin down, about this idea of disloyalty and mistrust and that flow of information being so important, and intelligence. And I referred to a British unit being killed around that same time, so it's not to say that was the reason they did it, but you could see how it could be believed that in this context. And at the end of the day, the treaty is... Yes, the War of Independence is over, but the revolution's not over. The treaty is about Britishness as well and eradicating colonialism or opposition to the treaty. So to have that British link, I found, could still put you in danger. We had ex-servicemen being killed in 1922-23, because of that British,
That's right.
However we conceive of it, loyalism, Britishness, which isn't a religious only concept.
I'm keen to open it up to questions. We have one here at the front. I think we've got a roving mic so people online can hear. But I think that point, while we wait for the mic, of that point of the uncertainty of the moment, the flux. We had this last year when we were thinking about partition, and border and the long period of time with that, with people living with that kind of uncertainty?
Hi. My wife, Shirley, her grandfather was on the list of people to be targeted, William Perrott. And the pension review, not the pension, the compensation review, it said that he escaped and spent 5 weeks in England, leaving his wife then, who must have been late 20s, early 30s, to run the farm. And with 4 children. And so the question I had was more about the women's role in this. There was some sort of like a sort of an understanding that the women would not be attacked because she was on her own. She, for whatever reason, if the husband was a target, would the wife or not would be a target? It would be a bigger atrocity perhaps if they wiped out the family. Or was there even a sense that even the women and the wives were actually helping and supporting in a network? It's really sort of the role of the women in that.
Well, there, with few exceptions, they didn't kill women. I think there's 3, 4 maybe that I can think of.
There were 1 or 2, right, but not too many. So
I'm going to give it in as a...
At Alton-Navay, one of the people killed is a woman.
Can't hear you.
So at Alton-Navay, outside Newry, 2 months later, there's an IRA reprisal attack that kills 6 Presbyterian farmer families members, and one of those is a woman.
Because now, as then time went on, women were as likely a target as men in sort of atrocities, and I wonder, so there was a sort of transition period where suddenly everyone went on.
I think there's, military culture, paramilitary culture, how the IRA saw itself is important. So this idea about conducting yourself properly as a proper army, so maintaining this division between civilian and armed perpetrator, which is why these things were so sickening to many at the time, in the sense that, and indeed why, on the other side, Colin's squad, when he went in and killed intelligence officers in their bed, literally wearing their pyjamas, this is not good. It's not just war. So there is possibly this need for around presenting that kind of masculinity at the time to maintain that division, but it doesn't mean that women weren't adversely affected because of their gender in the way you described. You're very vulnerable and left at home. So it's often in the work I've done, and many other people, Linda Connolly, who's here, Shifra Aiken, are writing about the kind of trauma that women suffered at this time. And so, yes, rare to be killed, but gender-based violence and other things could absolutely be around in these communities. And I suppose it's also important to make that distinction between what happened in the military situation and also the danger women and children are in the domestic space. And in a guerrilla war, a lot of it happens in the domestic space, so it's quite hard to I guess it's quite hard to trace and quite hard to talk about. But yeah, absolutely, it's often the women who are like literally opening the door to the raiders, and they're the ones who are left behind. A lot of the places that I've looked at in terms of burnings, it was house burnings. It's often the female domestic staff who get the worst of it, in a sense, because the men aren't there, so they're kind of left to deal with this. So a lot of some interesting testimonies on burning of big houses and so forth from female servants.
Another question I see a hand at the back.
Maybe I'll stand up because it's hard to see. Women were targeted, particularly if they had relationships with the enemy in different ways. They were harassed. They were, hair cuttings. There's extensive reporting of hair cuttings, things like leaving a wreath on a constable's grave and all of that, and looked at that in a lot of detail. But I'm curious, every time I hear the Alton-Navay massacre being mentioned as well, there's a crucial piece of detail left out. And I've noticed this and the corollary in the relationship of attacks on Protestant women as well, where women are targeted. The sexual violence in the Maguile public house occurs between the 2 killings that you're talking about. And obviously they were connected with the IRA, but again, this is an example of what you're talking about. And again, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not that, I would call that an atrocity. Allegedly, it was a specials. There's different views as to whether that was an order or what we might call opportunistic violence, but there is certainly more evidence coming to the fore. And what you see is a cycle of violence where women do become intertwined with the conflict that is happening. But I think it's very clear in the case of Altnavay that whereas that may not have been the stimulus, the exact stimulus, it's certainly the sexual violence towards women, Republican women, was certainly a factor in the cycle of violence in that period, and some of the same actors were involved. So I think we have an awful lot to look at. And then just very quickly, in terms of conflict migration then, I'm just wondering about the word fled, because conflict migration is a very complex thing. People just don't pick up and flee. There's different dynamics at work. Andy, you mentioned the economic, and also there was a lot of internal migration. So again, some of the women's families I've looked at, they, in the context of the border, they went south. In other cases, in parts of Tipperary I've looked at, they went to Dublin, and South Dublin seems to have become a place where a lot of Protestants ended up. So I think sometimes we need to be careful with language as well, that when we're discussing sectarianism, that, you know, there were also, I suppose, people in periods of conflict, they also, you know, people, they keep having relationships, they still love each other, they do all these other things that happen in life, and that's the social part, I think, Gemma, you were talking about earlier. Thank you very much.
I'd like to respond to that point about Altnavay. This is something that's sometimes been said about Altnavay. Recently, there was an incident of a woman being sexually assaulted, possibly raped, possibly by specials, and this has been seen as part of the reason for the reprisal. This has been questioned by Robert Lynch and others. That incident did happen, but reprisals were taken out straight away against other members of the specials, and therefore the event that happened at Altnavay was not to do with that. That's certainly the argument that's been put forward, so I think there's a question mark over this. Well, yes, but it's not sure that was to do with what happens in Altnavay. There was 6 people, including one woman, who were then killed by order of Frank Aiken. And this is seen as linked to the killing of several IRA men by specials before that.
On that point about the sort of the fleeing, whether that is the right word or not, I mean, some of it's clearly temporary. I mean, the case we were just hearing, some of it's permanent. Have you reflections on that, on what the calculus for people who've been on receipt of this kind of violence is when they think about whether they return? And that's sort of linked to a wider question about why does this stop? Because what is striking about the Bandon Valley killings is how anomalous they are in the minds of people at the time, as you said, Brian, and it's a spasm of violence that stops in a way that tragically isn't the case in the north. So I'd be interested in both the temporary nature of some of the flight and then what causes this to end.
Yes. Well, I mean, this violence is appalling, and you mentioned the violence in the north, and that is absolutely true. And we must remember that and remember the victims. At the same time, I'm reluctant to use terms like pogrom or ethnic cleansing. Now, the reason for that is that in the north, there are some 500-600 people killed. Of those, about 400 are Catholic. Now, in Belfast, something like that. And of that number, Catholics are about 55%, although they're only 25% of the population. So without doubt, they suffer more than anybody else. That is absolutely clear. But on the other hand, several hundred Protestants also are killed in that period by the IRA in the north. And the other point is that in the period 1911 to 1926, the number of Catholics goes up in Belfast by 2,000, which would make Belfast a unique city for a pogrom. That just doesn't happen. This was violence, excessive violence against Catholics. The term pogrom, I think, is incorrect. And it's incorrect also in another sense. It doesn't compare to pogroms that were going on in Europe at this time. I mean, they're appalling. Simnia, where the Turks were killing hundreds of thousands of Greeks. There were I believe, in Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of Jews were being killed. Millions of people were being moved out. So what happened in Belfast was appalling, but it doesn't compare to that. And that also applies to what goes on in the south. A large number of Protestants leave, they're forced out. If you exclude military, I think you might come up with a figure maybe of 6, when you exclude maybe 30 or 40,000. That's terrible. But I cannot call it ethnic cleansing for 2 reasons. One is the government was not involved in that. The government was completely opposed to that. That's an important point. And the second point is, likewise, these expulsions are terrible, but they don't compare to the millions who are being moved out of West, Eastern and Central Europe. It just doesn't compare. So these are terrible times, but we shouldn't think Ireland's unique. And we'll want to bear in mind other things that are going on, and we have to be careful what terms we use. I think pogrom and ethnic cleansing, you might say there are elements of a pogrom or elements of ethnic cleansing, but I don't think what happened in Ireland deserves those terms.
So, yeah, the case of Belfast is interesting. If we compare the Catholics in the north, and particularly Belfast, with the Protestants in the south, the demographic, the contrast is interesting, because the Catholics seem to, those who are burnt out or so on, they move to another part of the city rather than emigrate. Now, some do emigrate to Glasgow, and they go to Dundalk and to Dublin also. There is a little bit of movement, but the Protestant emigration is substantial. But we've got to deal with the period between 1911 and 26, and I have slight differences perhaps with both Brian and Don on how we've interpreted that data, but the Protestants were emigrating in larger numbers to the Empire and to Britain even before the First World War. So we do have slight differences there, which I don't know if we can resolve here today. But I mean, certainly I agree that quite a number moved out in this period also. There was a substantial movement out. And I think that in looking at Dunmanway, these surviving families, like your own, the evidence from these families is very important, because they're survivors. They gave testimony. They put in compensation claims. And some of them are still around. They stayed, and some of them left. But the families where the people were killed, they more than not, they tended to leave. It was too traumatic for the wives and the family. But some also stayed. Their descendants are still around.
Well, yeah, but the decision to leave was very much an individual one, and you see people leaving for fairly light reasons, but you also see people staying under the most terrible stress, threats of being killed and even being injured. So that's one point. The other thing is, somebody alluded to the internal migration as well. There was a tendency to develop what I call a ghetto mentality. You move to an area where there's lots of you around, and one of the things that happened was on the western seaboard, where Protestants were thin on the ground. The loss was even greater. Not all of those emigrated, but they might have emigrated to Dublin. They might have migrated to Dublin. But and there's interesting other little things. In between 1911 and 1926, in 1911 there was quite a smallish Jewish community, I think in Waterford and in Cork. They were wiped out by 1926. They'd all moved to Dublin.
So there was an internal migration going on within the minority, including the Jews, who might not wish to be included in that minority, but all the minorities seem to there seem to be a movement.
Gemma?
Just a few responses on those points, and really good question about internal migration and this decision to leave, as Don says, being very personal, and sometimes people are better able to make that decision because they have the resources and they can go and they've got all the houses to live in, and if you don't have another house, it's their house, so that's a factor. Class is a big factor in this as well. In terms of when it stops, that's really interesting, because a lot of the people I look at, so William Rowe, he's a shopkeeper in Lismore in Waterford, and he was probably part of this class who you mentioned, where it's a stronger community, relatively speaking. There are more Protestants, and he's serving his co-religionists in his shop. So he talks about anti-British sentiment. He doesn't say anti-Protestant, still being a factor in 1927, but he's still living there. So that's interesting. But other people would go, then come back, and that's kind of, I think that's why we need, as well as these qualitative accounts and the stories, David Fitzpatrick did really great work to look at that in depth at West Cork Methodists, and trace it, like who left and who came back, and actually do that numerical analysis. Just on the question of, and I just didn't do all of that myself because there's too many to look at. So we need all this combination of approaches, right? On the sort of the pogrom, ethnic cleansing, I mean, absolutely, we have to be so careful with these terms because they have legal meaning and they are important to get right because we use them in international law to make sure people are prosecuted who do, war crimes, etc., etc. But I guess with the thing about pogrom is it does imply that state involvement, or semi-state at least, which you do have in Northern Ireland more so than in the South in terms of, B specials. These are people who are attached to the police force of the new regime, Stormont, so you can see why that would be perhaps has more relevance as a term as compared to what's happening in the South, where we don't have an organised, we don't have the Free State. They want to appear to the world to be a new stable democracy, not to be sort of.
Yeah, 2 points on that one. Was the sectarian thing was so anathema to the Republican principle, so there was lots of, we couldn't do that, or that would be impossible for that to happen, sectarianism and so on. But the other thing about the Protestant decline between 1911 and 1926, and why it was so debilitating for the Protestant community, was that it was a high number of families who left. So in an economic migration, you lose a son, you may even lose two sons, but with family migrates, you lose two generations.
We had a question at the back. Sorry, come on.
Yes, I'd like to
can
ask
we
the
just
panel, please.
We've got the mic.
Maybe it's not working. It's speaking. Thank you. Would the panel care to express any views on whether there was an influence of alcohol in these terrible Dunmanway and Mid-Cork, West Cork killings?
Yes.
I think there was there is some testimony from one of the survivors, kind of in Clonakilty. There's allusion to alcohol, but I haven't actually seen it in the other cases. But Don might be.
Well, there was Mrs. Nagel thought they were drunk for a start, I think.
Yeah.
The other thing was that when they happened, particularly the Dunmanway events, I mean, the reports of it was a midnight mob marching up the street
after the pub shuts.
Exactly, and you can imagine them drowning their sorrows over poor Michael O'Neill and saying, we've got to do something about this. Yeah. And I think there was an element of that, yeah.
Well, in the north there was as well. There were terrible riots in Belfast in July and August 1920. The Reverend John Redmond was the vicar of Ballymacarrt in East Belfast. He went out to stop these rioters. Physically put himself in danger to do that. He was convinced that alcohol was part of the problem. Strong drink, he was convinced about that. And when it was, a lot of spirit grocers were raided and their goods were taken. So after it was all over, he said he joined the temperance movement, became a very strong temperance reformer. It not only helped riots, but it led to terrible social problems. And he set out to close down spirit grocers, which he did. These were all closed down in the north by 1923. He was convinced that alcohol was part of the problem. Gemma, of these riots.
In your study on everyday violence, is there a chicken and egg thing here? Do people, when they're going to do things that are transgressive, need to steel themselves with drink, or is it the drink that causes it? I mean, what's your theory on that?
Yeah, so it's a good question, because it very much is that, we know it plays a role in violence, in militarism, in kind of giving courage. But then on the other hand, there's also, as I was mentioning before, this idea about discipline being very important. And, when Sinn Féin clubs were opened from around the time of 1917-18, a lot of them didn't have alcohol as part of the guiding principles. So it's, I think, like pubs and pub culture is also really important, because it's a place for information to be passed and for people to get together. So a lot of suspicion can come around from people being together, but whether or not they're actually under the influence is another question. But I'd say it does play a role.
got a couple more questions. One.
Yeah, it wasn't really a question, it's just about the comment, really.
Can we, just for the, it's so the online people can hear.
Yeah. It was a comment really to Don Wood. I mean, just comparing my maternal grandparents and paternal grandparents, that, you know, William Perrott, he left for I don't know how long. I think he took my father with him, not sure, and he had cousins in Bradford, so they stayed there. But then he came back, presumably because my grandmother was there and kept the farm and had the children. On my mother's side, my grandfather had sold his farm somewhere near Bandon, and went to live near Bristol for 2 years and then came back. But they decided not to go back to that area, even that was where, you know, the vicaries were, those vicaries, but bought a farm at Passage West, because my grandmother wanted to be near Cork, and in fact my grandfather didn't want to go back. It was my grandmother who wanted to go back because her father was really aged. So just in you know, my family, there were very different reasons for staying or leaving. You know, and it could, with my mother's family, it could have been that they would not have come back if my grandmother said, "Okay, we'll stay." You know, and but yeah, well, later generations did leave, obviously. Thank you.
Can I just say, internal migration and people leaving and not coming back, it depends a lot on the reception you get at the other side, how people receive you. Now, what happens in Ireland in case of the Belfast Catholics, many of them leave in early 1920, they come down south, the government and Republicans take over various Protestant institutions to house these people. The government then funds relief and provides resources for them. But in September 1923, there's a debate in the Dáil about this. And Cosgrave he points out, we're looking after 1,500 people at the moment from the north. But he said, I want to know, they're all women and children. Where are the men? I know where they are. They're out with the regulars fighting against the government in the hills. That's where they are. And the government then starts to reduce this aid they're giving to these immigrants who've come from the north. But when he says that, someone interrupts him and says, no, because you've got that wrong. A lot of them actually are in the Free State Army. And that is absolutely true. A lot of them were in the Free State Army, in the new Free State Army. But what happens in 1923-24? The Free State Army is disbanded. It's not disbanded, but it's reduced in number. These guys are put out of work. There's no work in the south for them. They're not entitled. They don't have homes. There are letters written by some of these guys to government ministers trying to get aid, and they're turned down. One case is where 3 write in looking for aid. When the government minister finally makes up his mind, one of them's already gone home. So a lot of them return, partly because there isn't any work down here. They don't have homes down here, and a lot of them go back, and that is why the numbers in Belfast of Catholics actually go up. And the number of Catholics, the decline is some 10,000 over all of Northern Ireland in that period from 1911 to 26, compared to much bigger numbers down south.
Leonard?
Yeah, my question is one of command and control. Yeah, my question is about command and control, Jurgen, and the secondary part to my question about the local Bandon Valley massacre. My secondary question is about why I guess it's the anti-treaty side, didn't discipline or retrospectively deal with something that clearly they were in disagreement with.
Right, is this to me?
General.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I suppose this issue of disobeying the brigade leadership, Hales, and the very public pronouncement in the newspapers, you know, that they would desist from these attacks and to hand up their arms and so forth. It does indicate that there's a big disagreement between the brigade leadership and what's going on locally, possibly the local leadership in situ. Why were they not disciplined? Well, we were just coming into the Civil War, don't want another split. And this really falls into the background of bigger questions when as we move into the Civil War. So there is court cases. There is a court case in the case, as I mentioned, of later of the guy in Lane, Thomas Lane, but they can't proceed with the conviction because no witnesses will come forward. But I think generally within the Republican movement, there is a desire not for any further splits, and that's really they're willing to just let it pass. That'll be my interpretation of why it wasn't dealt with.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things is reading Liam Deasy's account of the time.
Yeah.
Liam Deasy was in charge of the whole of the Southern Division, so I think he was based in Mallow, I think, wasn't it? And it was his watch. This happened when he was in charge of the county, at least. He never mentions it in his autobiography. He says everything was quiet down here between mid-April and June.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that DC says that the spies and informer issues and the anti-Sinn Féin thing had been sorted out in 21. So there's a conflict in view between the leadership about this issue and the locality. The local interpretation is that there's still an anti-Sinn Féin society and it has to be dealt with. So there's a difference between Ballina and Niskeen and the rest of the brigade.
But can I ask you to raise one question on this? I mean, I've seen the 9 pension claims as well and all the rest of it. But are you saying that there was a sort of a second list of suspects besides the official one that was drawn up in January?
I don't know if there was a list. I think they had an idea in their heads of their suspects.
But who?
Paddy
O'Brien certainly didn't.
I think one of the issues was the auxiliaries from Dunmanway were patrolling and visiting households, and when they were visiting these Protestant households, there was suspicion about them. If the auxiliaries arrive at your front door, generally it's sensible to be friendly to them, all right? But just because you're friendly to them doesn't mean you're informing. You don't want them. And I think that might have given rise to suspicion of some of these households that we have no explanation whatsoever as to why.
But wouldn't the auxiliaries have been visiting all sorts of households?
Sorry?
Wouldn't the auxiliaries have been visiting households other than Protestant ones?
Oh, they would. But they would tend to return to households where people were friendly as opposed to hostile. If they were not getting anything out of a household, they wouldn't. Or if it was they would tend to return to households that are where they get some kind of a reception.
So I suppose that in the end, the sort of difference in interpretation, listening to you, is whether that was really the case with these families, because if these are the selection of victims in the Bandon Valley killings is exclusively of one denomination, plus a Methodist. There must have been many families who could have been evidentially subject to the same critique from the IRA, whether official or not. So why is it? How do you explain that in this case? How do you explain the fact that the victims are all Protestants?
How do I explain that? Well, that's the big multi-million-dollar question, isn't it? We've been trying to answer for 10 years.
Should we have a go now?
I mean, I suppose my interpretation that it's not a case of any old Protestant will do. There are lots of Protestants in West Cork that could have been attacked, who weren't attacked. I think certain households were selected because the IRA believed, rightly or more often wrongly, in this case obviously, that they were connected with Crown Forces or providing information.
But presumably they'd had this information for months. Why hadn't they acted on it before?
Yeah, why didn't they act in September 1921 or October 1921?
Well, one of the pension claims says they didn't know about 5 of these until later. That's why.
Oh, later. Yeah.
Well, I have to say, I regard these, ideas just as excuses. I mean, this was a sectarian act, and we want to be able to acknowledge that. I think we've come to a stage where people on various sides can look back and there are things they were wrong and they're prepared to acknowledge that. And it's only when we do that we can move forward. Now, there have been other efforts at reconciliation. One I think is important happened in County Longford. I don't know if you read about this, Clonfin. There was a famous ambush there in February 1921. General Sean McEwen ambushed 2 lorries of auxiliaries. They killed 4 of them, wounded 8, and the others surrendered. Now, unlike Kilmichael, the ones who surrendered then were helped and looked after. And this was really, they'd carried out an ambush, but they acted in a civil manner to prisoners of war, unlike at Kilmichael. But what happened a few months ago was there was a commemoration of this, I think in 1921. There was an ecumenical service to commemorate this event. So at the site of the ambush, they had an ecumenical service involving parish priest and Church of Ireland rector. And then what also happened was, and I think this was quite remarkable, was that a woman called Maeve Brady did a very generous act of reconciliation. She could only do this, I think, because of who she was. She was a sister of Mercy, nun, and her father had been in the ambush party that had killed these men. She then went on a voyage, a series of visits to the graves of these 4 men. She went to England, laid flowers on the grave and prayed. She took then a copy of this, and that's available to see. So this was a real act of reconciliation, prepared to acknowledge the other side, people who died, and I think it was quite remarkable and worth bearing in mind.
I was just always also add on to this idea that I think came through really strongly what Brian was talking about reprisal culture. It's not controversial. It shouldn't be controversial to say that there was this tit for tat mentality. So you can still be selective, even if there's not a particular personal detail about that person. So there is this, the British were doing like for like as well. I mean, the people whose houses they burned in Cork, it was quite tenuous how you prove whether you're an IRA supporter or Republican, or so it's you can still stand for something, and it's a kind of almost then a bonus when you find out some extra information that you can add on top and contextualize that. So that's not to say this was sectarian in every case because it wasn't. But I think the evidence we have seen supports that more strongly than in other cases.
Robert at the back has a question.
Okay, I hope this isn't controversial, but 100 years of analysis. 100 years. How do we move on from here?
Good point. Very good point.
I'm not sure we've been analysing for 100 years.
I think, that's a good point, Don. We haven't been analysing it academically or rigorously for all that time. We need to continue talking about it because it's our jobs. No, but seriously, I think that's what I tried to address towards the end in terms of what is the value of these interpretive frameworks, and why are we still getting so caught up on it? And it shouldn't be controversial to call out awful behaviour when we see it wherever, because we have legal protections now for hate crime, which we didn't have in the past. So I think as I said, events like this, and there's always going to be those gaps, of course, but I don't see the problem as long as we're still contextualising it and not getting too focused on the extremes and the spectacles, and not to the detriment of as we were discussing earlier, you know, women's voices and voices of other marginalised people. So we also need to have that. We need to have that wider context of what's happened. But the fact is we haven't done it all yet. You know, there is more and more stuff to come because there are more and more records coming out. We've talked about military pensions, we've talked about witness statements. You know, it's such a well-documented revolution, but it's not all been studied yet. And I guess, you know, not to make it too contemporary, but it's still a disputed territory, Ireland, isn't it? Like we're still, you know, Brexit. So we can't really. I don't think it's ever going to end unless. So, I don't know. Sorry, like unless the political situation changes drastically, shall we say?
Could I come in? So today it's really more of an academic matter than anything else. I think that would be one point I'd like to make. But another point I'd like to make is that this issue is very fraught because it was part of the propaganda war. The propaganda war was hugely important in the Irish War of Independence, and I think this is one of the reasons the British lost the propaganda war, because of the reprisal campaign and the effect that had on public opinion in Britain in particular. I think that was very important. But the British, on their side, they tried to draw attention. Their campaign, in contrast to the Republicans, was to try and demonstrate that the Republican campaign was a sectarian campaign and they were killing Protestants. So every time a spy was shot, it was a Protestant that was mentioned in the papers. If it was a Catholic, it wasn't mentioned. So I think that was important. And in the longer term, in terms of the historiography, the importance of sectarianism in the Northern Troubles raised the whole issue again and gave it a new currency from the important work of Peter Hart in raising the whole question again. I think Peter, I think he was right on Dunmanway and the sectarian significance, but I think he overplayed the significance of sectarianism in the whole revolution. So these now are really, as I said, academic questions at this stage. I think society has largely moved on, but the issues are now moving out of memory and more into historical sources and the pension evidence you mentioned and so forth. And academics will go on with it for some time yet, as long as we have an audience.
Jeff has it.
I feel, may I respond to that question? Yes, I'm not so sure that it's only academics concerned about these things at the moment. I think there is a wider public interest, and we've had a number of public gestures I think are very important, reconciling us after 100 years. We've seen that with the First World War, where it was possible to do it with things like Messine and the Somme, important gestures of reconciliation. So I think it's important that on the one hand we remember these positive aspects. I mean, I pointed out how the Bishop Dowes in 1923 pointed to the good relations that continued between many Protestants and Catholics during this period. It's important we remember that. But at the same time, we can acknowledge these things and acknowledging them and repenting in some cases for things that our community can all be part of a healing process. This is something that we can move on with. Now, I'm glad historians, of course, will continue with their work, and that's all very important. But I do feel in Ireland, where history is so important, and people feel history is important, it's important that historians take objective and compassionate views on these historical matters.
Cliff.
Yeah, I'd like to just mention, I suppose, the kind of the pastoral aspect of it, which you alluded to in your talk a little earlier. 100 years had gone by, and Bishop Colton had this tour, if you like, of all the different places. And one of the services was in the parish that I was looking after in Dunmanway at the time. And we reached out to the other churches in the area where they all had kind of a penitential part of their service, and they all brought a candle to a central service where we had a retelling of the story without any judgment, but it was just to remember. And afterwards, chatting to the people from the Church of Ireland community, it was they had, I suppose, forgotten about this because of fear, because it was something that had happened to their families. And from the Roman Catholic side, it was more, they had forgotten it because of shame. It's something that happened from their side of the community, but they hadn't remembered it. It was just a really interesting angle to it. But the reconciliation part of it, the communities now are getting on really well together. And I think, we debate all these things from an academic point of view, but from a pastoral point of view, people are moving on, which is really good to answer the question that was asked there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that in terms of picking up on Brian's point about the meaning of it beyond academia. So it's wonderful to hear about those initiatives, and because a lot of peace reconciliation, it is being done through church or through non-governmental organisations. There are still bodies missing there are still people buried in Northern Ireland and we don't know where they are, and there's still, there's not been a official transitional justice process, or has not been truth and reconciliation commissions like there have been in other countries, and it's not necessarily the catch-all answer to every situation, and that's a different question, but I think that's a really important point to raise, is like all of this stuff and the healing and the compassion that Brian mentioned, which I think is important, and it's good to be compassionate with people who you disagree with as well. This stuff happens, this also goes alongside, I think, these ongoing initiatives from those outside of the academy and also outside of the government, because the fact is that the governments don't always do what's best for everyone, and maybe not always, maybe what's sort of there are often very understandable reasons why we can't go wading into X, Y, Z because of the imperative to stable institutions and so on and so forth. So thank you for that contribution.
Well, the other thing that I think will make it easier in the future is that Ireland's population is increasing, and the Protestant population is increasing for the first time in 100 years. Now, a lot of those extra members are actually immigrants who don't carry the same baggage that us old fogies who've been here since 1600 have.
Andy?
Yeah, I suppose one point I would like to make on the whole Dunmanway massacre is that compared to the North and the question of sectarianism, Cork wasn't a deeply sectarian society going back pre-First World War. And since then, I don't think, it certainly hasn't had the same sectarian problems that the North has had since then. And this makes the Dunmanway episodes stand out so much. I think it makes it really something very important to study, to try and understand why. But I certainly think to understand it, we've got to look in detail at each case, at each survivor, at each of the cases where people were killed, at all the sources we can find on it. And I think eventually the truth is gradually coming out. I'm optimistic about that. I think we've gone a long way in the last 10 years with it even. And we've got a clearer picture of it than we did 10 years ago. So historians have to keep tipping away at it.
It's a sort of inadvertent link between the subject matter of yesterday and today, that public relief schemes are important, and clearly they're important for historians as well as everybody else in this. Do we have any other questions? I think we are indebted to the four panelists. They've been willing to think in a whole variety of different ways, but I don't want to deny anyone online either. I've been looking at my phone not because I'm a millennial obsessive, but in case we've been getting WhatsApps from our online, but I'm told we haven't on the chat. Anyone else in the room? William.
I suppose just to give a slightly larger context to it, that tomorrow is the 8th of August, and in the 8th of August 1922, Free State troops landed in Union Hall and came in and retook Skibbereen from Republican forces. So it's... So I suppose that, that was... just to give a larger context, that this was part of a bigger conflict and a bigger civil war that was going on at the time, and just remember that this is a very important week in the history of Skibbereen, and to remember that.
Yes, we should. There's this great Saki quote about Crete, which he says, an island that produces more history than it's possible to consume locally. And it seems to me that Ireland is the same. This is also an area which produces more centenaries than it's possible to consume. We have one last question at the back.
Just an aside, but of the forgotten of the conflict, or perhaps those not involved in the conflict. I posted something on Twitter, I think about 12 months ago, about the burning of a local workhouse in County Limerick, and got feedback of at least 5 other workhouses around the country that were burned during this period. And yet I've never seen a historian address or raise that issue.
Gemma, you're on burning.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the arson expert, yeah. I mean, so I would love to get your name so I could check your Twitter post on that, because I've done a lot of work on arson and fire as protest, and got a chapter in my book on the Civil War about why the anti-treaty IRA used it as a tactic, and I've also subsequently been thinking about why the British and indeed like Dutch colonial troops have used fire as a punitive weapon against civilians. So I will just reassure you that there's research ongoing on arson. But yeah, so that's, I mean, the workhouse is an interesting, because again that links back to what we were talking about yesterday about the famine and sort of targeting of public institutions, which is sort of physical and practical and military, but also symbolic. So I have noted that down. Thank you for that point.
Can I make a final link between the famine and 1921? In 2014, I was at Armagh Cathedral for a service to commemorate the Battle of Clontarf. It happened 1,000 years earlier. Now, why would that be held in Armagh? Because Brian Boru is buried in Armagh. Now, present at the service was Lord Inchiquin, who is a descendant of Brian Boru, and he's also a descendant of William Smith O'Brien from 1848. So I went up to him after the service, and I said, Lord Inchiquin, I want to congratulate you on one of your ancestors. Now, he looked at me probably thinking I was going to talk about William Smith O'Brien or our friend who was killed at the Clontarf. Oh, yeah, Brian Boru, yes. And I said, Lucius O'Brien. So he said, I said, in 1847, Lucius O'Brien was the MP for County Clare. He was also chair of Ennis Workhouse. Word came down from Dublin Castle that the soup kitchens, which had been funded by the government, were to close in August. That's what the word came down from Dublin. He refused to accept that. He went back to Dublin Castle to protest, to say that he wanted to keep his soup kitchens, government funded, he wanted to keep them open for longer. And he got permission to do so. And those soup kitchens stayed open for much longer than anywhere else in the country. So I said, Lord Inchiquin, I want to congratulate you on that. And he said to me, well, in 1921, the IRA turned up to burn down Dromoland Castle, which was his home. They turned up to burn it down. But the local IRA turned up, and they said, no, you can't do that. The O'Briens have been very good landlords. And the castle was not burnt down. So there's a link between the famine and 1921.
Well, as they say in Jane Austen, I think we've probably delighted you for long enough. Can I ask you all to thank Gemma, Don, Andy and Brian for participating? And to thank everybody both who has joined us over the last 2 days in person and online for supporting us. It's been a fascinating couple of days. I hope you all agree. It's been great to make a step back towards normality. On the Lucius O'Brien quote, on the off chance I haven't told some of you this story, and it links directly to what one should do with word coming down from Dublin. We were, as you all know, honoured to have the Taoiseach here yesterday. Victoria and I had written to him early on officially and got a message from the office of the Taoiseach that explained that he was a busy man, we were a small festival. Then a week ago, from his constituency office in Cork, of course, I get a call. And she says, we've told him he shouldn't come, but he wants to. So we said, that's great, fantastic. And we talked about what would be possible and if we get a couple of hours from the Taoiseach. And then a day later, I have an email again from the office of the Taoiseach in Dublin saying, the Taoiseach has invited me to, or asked me to inform you that he is unable to accept your invitation because of the burdens of state, etc., 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 you'll understand. So I texted the lady in the constituency office and said, we're very sorry to hear, has there been a change of plan? And got a terse but brilliant response. No change of plan. That's Dublin for you. So I responded with hashtag the real capital. Anyway, Victoria, come up because this is a joint endeavour. We just want to thank all of you for coming. And I should thank my co-founder, who should do some talking now rather than being me.
Oh, really?
Take a step closer.
I haven't got much to add, really, except to say thank you again for coming. To all the live stream people, thank you for bearing with us with a few technical hitches. It's great to have you with us. And we say this every year. We say we're never going to do a history festival again. And then about a week later, we say, let's do another history festival. So we'll see you next year in person.
And that will only be possible with the help of all the friends that we've had. I can't name all of them. Some of them are in the room. Some of them are on planes back, as are some of our contributors from yesterday. But thank you to all of them too.